Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I think we will have greater divisions than today between America and anyone who depends on America for their security, and let's call it China and potentially Russia. What I think is interesting is where will the rest of the world be in this divide?
Welcome to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to affect markets, countries and economies like never before. We've created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Allegra Stratton.
I'm Adrian Wooldridge.
And I'm Stephanie Flanders.
So at the top of the show, you just heard from our guest this week. He's the former director of the international affairs think tank Chatham House, Robin Niblett. He joins us for a conversation about how China will factor into the US and UK elections. Steph, we did that one together, didn't we?
Yeah, we did it. We did it a few weeks back. We did not have the benefit of Adrian's wisdom in the conversation. We're going to get it in a minute, though. But it sort of took us back to China, which I guess we haven't focused on so much in the last few weeks. And he specifically, you think of it a little bit when you see these sort of D-Day commemorations. He talks about the challenge for Europe of rethinking their geopolitical positioning in the world and whether or not governments are sort of stepping up sufficiently to that challenge, and actually contrast it with Asia, where he feels they've always been much more engaged in the regional rivalry and the threat it poses.
Also on the show today, we're going to talk about India once again. On Monday, exit polls suggested Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
We're going to try it again.
We should now know. I mean, we should have known. We have all covered politics enough to know that you should never talk about an election before the actual result is in.
Well, I mean, and in our defence, we did talk about it was just the exit polls, and Rushi Bhatia, who was our correspondent on the ground, was mentioning that in some past elections the exit polls had not been very effective, but actually the last couple they had worked. And I think it's a very interesting question why Modi's BJP party underperformed so dramatically.
OK, well, we'll cross back over to New Delhi later in the show when I'm going to speak to one of our reporters, Swati Gupta, on how India voted and how those coalition talks are shaking out. But first of all, shall we, guys, dip into the election that is happening all around us? It feels like a very busy week. It has been.
And Adrian, I've been watching some of your tweets and writing this week, and just you think things are just going to get worse for the Conservative Party.
Absolutely. I thought up till now that this was quite a boring election, a Labour victory, a Tory defeat, and, a change of government. Everything was going predictably. But then Nigel Farage came in, and that raises the possibility that we'll get a Labour super victory and a Tory super defeat and a real transformation in the nature of the right in this country, the Trumpification of the right in this country. That Farage really is a Trumpist figure. Both in style and in his beliefs. He's very close to Trump. He's very involved with Trump world. And if he wins the seat, Clacton, which he's standing for, and if the Reform Party is significantly responsible for splitting the right vote, he will be a major player in British politics and may well force the Tory party to move to the right.
So I guess the argument or the pushback on the longer term scenario would be if they hadn't entered the race, you would have felt there was a strong-ish possibility that Farage could become the leader of the Conservative Party after the election.
Still could. And
it would be the true Trumpification, because you would have what has often been the most sort of corrosive thing of having an established party taken over by a populist rather than an outside force that's going to find it harder to break through electorally. You could argue that to have him double down on reform was long-term less sort of, if you like, dangerous for the nation.
I think putting him in Parliament gives him even more of a platform than he's already got. He is as well positioned as he could be to Trumpify the Conservative Party. Now, we may see in the next few days and weeks a lot of money going to Farage. We may see the Reform Party excelling the Conservative Party in terms of its polling. We may see some very high-profile defections from the Conservative Party. So this is the greatest nightmare you could possibly have for the Conservatives. Now, this is an ancient party. It's got deep roots. It's got a fantastic brand name. So perhaps I'm bigging up this. We
usually spend our time talking about how it's the most successful political party in the history of political parties.
Absolutely. But it's been the most successful party partly because it's been willing to absorb other parties. It is called the Conservative and Unionist Party, and it's changed a lot over time. And perhaps we could see the Conservative and Reform Party.
It was interesting to look at the events of the week because, as you say, Tuesday of the week that we're recording in, it feels like a couple of months ago, doesn't it? Yeah. Tuesday, he announces in the morning, I'm going to make this emergency announcement. The world of Westminster didn't. There was a number of options. In the end, he announces he's going to take over Reform, but he's also going to run. And that was the sort of more extreme end of what people were predicting. So, and all of the events have played out as you suggest around, Reform is showing it's nudging up in the polls and is only 2 points behind the Tories. But then interestingly, when you then on Tuesday night get that debate and it focuses so much on tax, and then the next day, Farage is not really in the conversation. When he's talking about immigration, which is what they want to talk about, they talk about it being the immigration election. He is, enormously effective and he sort of dominates the agenda. But I am not sure that when the agenda moves on to other items, which the Labour and Conservative Party are making it do, because they want to talk about the economy and they want to talk about tax from their different perspectives, he has so much to say. And to your point about taking over the Conservative Party, all of those prospects and his ambition in that regard are not hidden, right? He talks about it, but to do that, you have to have a slate of policies.
Sure, it makes it more difficult for the two main parties to dominate the political agenda because both the Tory party and Labour Party, for their own different reasons, have a reason not to talk too much about immigration and the votes. Now, of course, Farage has exactly the opposite set of incentives, so it makes it more difficult to fight on the old electoral battleground. You have these populist things which people are intensely worried about, particularly Conservative voters, which the Conservative Party didn't want to talk about. Now they can't get away from. I also think in terms of the debate about the timing of the election, this, a lot of Conservatives are very unhappy that Rishi Sunak called an election in the summer rather than in the autumn. And that is only accentuated now by Farage's arrival, because in November he would have been off in the United States doing his thing over there and acting as a lip spittle to Donald Trump. He's now, using his summer, doing what he likes to do.
Do you think he's running because he thinks he's going to win this? Remember, he has run 7 times before. The sitting MP has I'm not saying
26,000 majority.
I'm not saying, but it's not. It wasn't the easiest one to pick.
Yeah, it's a 26,000 majority, but it is pure UKIP Farage territories. White working class, exiles, as it were, people who feel annoyed by multiculturalism, people who are very sensitive to the boats, people who are sort of down at heel. And he's
lots
a
of
superstar.
Drugs, county lines, crime problems.
Lots of drugs and county line. He's a superstar, and he really has galvanised this sort of thing. And if he does win, he's in a really good position to take over what is already a hollowed-out party, the Conservative Party, but will be even more hollowed out after the election.
Can we just spend 2 minutes to think about the Labour Party's perspective on this? Because if you imagine if Labour Party was as single-minded as the Conservative Party often has been on party and maintaining its power, and not necessarily always so focused on the nation and the good of the nation. If you're in that mindset and you're Labour, of course the temptation would be to say, this is us in power for the next 10 years, because you've got the Conservatives tearing themselves apart and going slightly crazy in just the way that we did with Jeremy Corbyn. I guess the alternative is to say, actually, this takes all of our politics in a really dangerous direction. And we've already learnt from the Brexit debate that can become very toxic and make governing very difficult. So this is not necessarily something we should welcome.
They haven't got a choice, though, have they?
It channels the opposition into foolish politics. From a political management point of view, from a Keir Starmer point of view, purely in the short term, it's great news. From the point of view of the health of our democracy, it's a really bad news, because healthy democracies, particularly when you have a very centralised system like ours, demand a healthy, responsible opposition that can keep you into account. But if I was sitting in Downing Street, I wouldn't say what I really want is a healthy, vigorous opposition. I want a crazy opposition that's tearing itself apart.
I mean, we're getting very ahead of ourselves, but I just wonder whether we be careful what you wish for if you're the Labour Party, because if you look at there is
they will be across this. They will. This is because.
But remember, we had actually the last few years we've all commented on it, that actually politics have become more normal again, and if this takes us more in that direction, yes, the Labour Party may have a clear reign, may even win the next election after this one, but you could ultimately be quite in a very unpleasant.
But are you right about the overall normalisation?
I don't think people think that's
of politics, because we're just about to have European elections next week.
No, I was just talking about the UK. We had these two boring people who were very mainstream. We've been saying we've normalised British politics. Nowhere else. Nowhere else is it normal.
We want exciting people. Yes, be careful what you wish for, indeed.
I'm in charge, aren't I? So I've got to move us on. But I think we've done a podcast right there. Anyway, so we are going to go now away from Nigel Farage and the UK election to our on-the-ground voice for the week. It's Bloomberg's reporter, Swati Gupta. Swati, hi.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Swati, so did you see this result coming?
To some extent, yes. The reporting that we had done on the ground over the past 6 months, I would say, and the people that we had been speaking to, me and a few colleagues in the office, it made us feel that unemployment and inflation would be major issues. Somehow they were not getting addressed when the campaigning began. And then the signs kind of solidified as soon as the voting process began, which is over a period of 6 weeks. We spoke to party officials who started confirming a little bit that things may not be going that well for the BJP. It is really hard to estimate that in an electorate which is this large, and with a prime minister who is so incredibly popular here.
So Swati, is it right to say that broadly this is a rejection of Modinomics, which essentially was an economic agenda that largely benefited billionaires and to a lesser extent the middle classes?
I wouldn't say it's a rejection. Indians have overwhelmingly still voted for Prime Minister Modi and his allies. I think it is sort of, in a way, a check that the voters have delivered, that, everything else is fine. We are heading to the moon, or we are going to become a developed country by 2047. But don't forget that it is the poor people who elect leaders in this country. I think it's a reminder from the voters that you cannot forget the people at the lowest level and just forge ahead.
What will it mean for his agenda in the next parliament then, once his coalition has been formed? What do you think he actually does, to your very eloquent phrase, to not forget the less well off?
Yeah, I mean, in the parliament, it is right now very difficult to estimate. A lot of the things that they had scheduled for the first 100 days, and Mr. Modi had been very clear that, we have it all planned out. That's now all gone up in the air, because when you are running a coalition government in India, what you want no longer is a priority. You have to, take everybody in the government along with you. And Mr. Modi is not used to working in a coalition. He never has. He's always ruled with absolute majority. So it would be interesting to see which of his reforms that will be sidelined. He was very keen to do labor reforms in India, but that pretty much, as an analyst told me a few days ago, that'll be in cold storage.
Well, one thing's for sure, Swati, you're going to be really, really busy. Thank you very much for taking time to come and speak to us here on Voternomics, and we'll speak to you again.
Thank you.
Now to a conversation Stephanie and I had with Robin Niblett. He's the former director of the international affairs think tank Chatham House. Niblett also recently published a book called The New Cold War, How the Contest Between the US and China Will Shape Our Century. As he explains it, the book's central thesis is that the division between the US and China and the mistrust is unbridgeable and it's here to stay. The two sides are, he thinks, reversing into a Cold War, and they're bringing in partners into either side of the conflict, one of China's partners being Russia.
And I decided to ask him about Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, because I remembered him saying at the time that he felt it could serve as a wake-up call to the West, both to decarbonise the economies quicker, because they'd want to reduce their reliance on Russian gas, but also to spur new alliances and a rethinking of European security. And having remembered him saying that, I just wanted to ask him whether he thought the West had actually seized those opportunities out of the crisis.
My bottom line is yes. Now, obviously, in democracies, turning a wake-up call into action is difficult, and it requires explicit language and narrative, and I think it's been especially difficult for Europeans to adapt, because the whole notion of European integration was built as a peace project, not as a war project. I think it's been easier in some ways for Australia, Japan, South Korea to get with the program more quickly, because that sense of insecurity has been so much more present, and they've got US troops still deployed there and exercises carried out in much more explicit ways. But has it been a wake-up call, and have people acted? Absolutely.
I guess the pushback on that would be there has been great rhetoric, but in terms of actual sacrifices being made in order to do more on defence, politicians, governments have been quite unwilling to actually spend a lot more. I mean, climate was the other thing that looked like there was an opportunity. But actually, if anything, there's been quite a lot of backsliding. So I guess what you could say, when it comes down to it, actually politicians aren't willing to let people pay a price for this kind of change.
Yes, there's a kind of transition phase which has to take place within a democracy. But it strikes me that where the German government, let's say in particular on its climate change transition is taking place, is that it has dropped adaptations that would have an immediate short-term impact on consumers. Heat pump requirements, for example. At the energy production level, the transition is fully underway. They're trying to give something to their publics with one hand, but if you look at the reduction of gas importation and the adaptation of that away from Russia, that's carrying a real cost. It's much more expensive to bring it in from the US. It's more expensive to bring it in from Qatar. But the long-term contracts have been signed by the German government on Qatar gas, for example. Again, the great announcement of 100 billion euros to be put more into German defence. Look, the problem is that they're so far behind the curve in Germany in being ready. The 100 billion has literally been soaked up like water put into a garden that's parched. It's just disappeared. And you see no added value. But that's because Germany was so unprepared. But Germany is hitting 2% of its GDP this year. That is a remarkable figure. Where we've come from in Europe and where we've got to in a democratic context, I think is impressive.
But is 2% enough?
Yeah. No, look, it's a fair question. Is 2% enough? If we look ahead, if this is a new Cold War, I believe it is, then if we're looking ahead 10, 20 years, 2% won't be enough. You could get to maybe 2.5, 3%. I think it'd be enough. But let's just look at
You think that is enough?
Oh, yeah, totally. Without the US, European GDP is 10 times Russia's. America could pull out, you should say, and theoretically, we should have the capacity to be able to take Russia on Ukraine. So this is not just about the amounts, it's about how the money is spent. So as people have always said, the problem with Europe is the defence part has been a kind of free rider, Potemkin kind of thing on top of the European project. And now people are realizing that you're perhaps going to have to start, for example, borrowing money to spend on defence.
Are people talking about that?
Absolutely. This is one of the new projects. Could you extend what was the 2-year Renew Europe post-COVID 790 billion euro fund that was created for 2 years to adapt the economies to a post-COVID and to a more energy-efficient environment? That is meant to end at the end of 2 years. Europe could collectively in the market borrow very large amounts to then be able to apply to defence production, for example, to start building up long-term munitions production. So it's not the amounts, it's the organisation. Europe has not been organised around security and defence. And I think this wake-up call and the fact that America is not reliable for European security, at least in the long term, I think is acting as a wake-up call. So Frank, I'm not worried about the 2%. To be honest, most people never thought Germany would get to 2% within 2 years. They're on 1.3. This is a big chunk of money when you look at the size of the German defense budget.
But in 1989, the US was spending 6%, something like that. And then probably most countries, certainly the UK, was probably spending something like that, 5, 6, 7% of GDP. So I guess if we're in the kind of really transformed situation geopolitically that you describe in the book, it feels like that conversation around 2% is symbolic of politicians' willingness to really say, look, we're in a different world now. We can no longer be sort of enjoying the benefits of this peace dividend. That is gone. That's since 1989. We have to face up to things being different. But are we anywhere close to that? We're looking at these two massive elections.
I think the most important point I want to make here is that we're not sitting on a trigger environment across a long front line between a nuclear-armed Soviet forces they were at the time, potentially about to pour through the Fulda Gap, which led to the kind of high levels of defense spending and high levels of concern and conscription that you had during the last Cold War. We're talking about a Cold War with China, which from a European standpoint is a long way away, and where the competition is going to be competed much more geo-economically and in competition with the global south and in competition over regulation on AI than it is going to be in the kind of Cold War. What I spent a lot of time in the book is talking about what's different about this Cold War to the last war. We can take on Russia with 2% of GDP. The problem is that if we're going to see China as a competitor globally, we're going to have to be rethinking our economic model in a different way. And that'll be expensive, but you won't see it on the defense budget side.
Well, that's interesting. We were talking about, and Allegra's been on the inside of some of these conversations about how the approach to China, how you describe it to people. Allegra, do you think there is an understanding within the government that we need to reframe our relationship with China? What does that even look like?
Well, the new language they're now using is that they want to not decouple, but they want to de-risk. So to explain their framing, it's let's get with the program. We have these huge economic dependencies on China. There's going to be a price impact if we pull out, or it's not feasible to pull out too aggressively. But equally, there's all these industries where it's highly sensitive. Every time they try to stake out that new position, they get pushed and pushed by new allegations of China's interference in the UK. So I think we probably haven't seen a settled position on this from the government, but I'd love to know what you think.
I agree there's not a settled position, and it's interesting compared to the US one as well, where they thought the administration, in a way, the Biden administration jumped on Ursula von der Leyen's term of de-risking because they realized the decoupling language, which was, as you said, starting to dominate the debate, was too extreme even for America, which had its largest trade ever with China in 2023. And, of course, would like to be able to keep a lot of that trade in agricultural products. Think of the air market. Can Boeing survive as a global air carrier and not be penetrating the Chinese market, which is already, by passenger numbers, apparently the largest market in the world, overtaking the US recently? So the Biden administration jumped on that more subtle framing, should we say, that the European side has provided, that Oliver Dowden actually repeated about de-risking being the goal and not decoupling. The problem is that de-risking implies that you understand the boundaries of the threat. And the initial notion of de-risking and the initial notion of the Jake Sullivan, US National Security Advisor, we're going to build a small yard with a high fence of protections, was that it would be artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and semiconductors. Fine. You could say, we don't want those areas, China, to be contributing to China's capacity to use those technologies to further improve its military threats to us, given that we do see China as a rival in the Indo-Pacific, and who knows what they're going to provide maybe to Russia someday down the line. The problem is that we've already discovered that even in the technological military space, cloud computing could be an alternative to having to use lots of very high-end semiconductors and chips from America. Why not just lob into cloud computing and use it that way and then be able to draw the models and imaging? You've had biotechnology. Now people are worried that biotech could be used in a military sense and for military purposes. So suddenly it's already expanded.
And in the UK example, EVs are interesting, aren't they? Because in the high fence, they wouldn't necessarily be in the yard, would they?
Exactly.
They might be with regarding to America, but in the UK, a lot of people think we need cheap EVs in order to make some of those EV targets possible. Yep. But then there's all these concerns about the tech that could be in the cars if they were imported, whether or not that's scaremongering or not.
Joe Biden has warned that Chinese cars and the tech could be a national security threat as they're driving around, they're picking up information. But the Chinese already did that. The Chinese don't allow Tesla cars to drive near government areas in China today. So, as I said, the Chinese were always one step ahead on this.
The slightly more kind of economic bent is just that it's not a stable equilibrium. Even just the idea of we were going to draw lines between things that are important to our national security and economic areas where we can continue to be entangled. The logic of everything you've described, as long as you have two distinct blocks, or at least superpowers, with fundamentally different values, a fundamentally different approach to governing, one authoritarian, one more open, it's not a stable situation to have the degree of economic entanglement that we have now. And once you accept that you're going to decouple in some areas, that the decoupling will have its own momentum, or is just not, or means nothing. I just wonder whether you think, if you were writing this book in 20 or 30 years' time, that we will be in a much more divided global economy, that we will have much more lines between the two sides.
I think we will have deep divisions and greater divisions than today between America and its allies are both Pacific and Atlantic, European and Pacific, anyone who depends on America for their security. And let's call it China and potentially Russia, which in particular they are joined at the hip at the moment for all the reasons we know. What I think is interesting is where will the rest of the world be in this divide? I talk about the countries in the global south, a term we all use now, having much more agency in this new Cold War and more capacity to triangulate between the two sides, play one off the other, which they've done. Certainly a country like India has done effectively. You could argue some of the Southeast Asians like Indonesia are doing it quite effectively. Saudi so far has done it quite effectively, though I worried a little the Middle East may force it a little bit back into the American camp. But the interesting thing is, will a country like Indonesia be forced to choose between the two technologies or not? I think not. Will countries in Latin America be forced to choose between the two? I think not, because they do not rely on America for their security, and China in a way is not a direct threat to them. So the question is then, are they able to pick and choose between different options, should we call them, literally, Chinese EVs and Chinese technology, mixed up maybe with some European or American technology, and say we will take both and force the two to compete? That's the kind of almost positive side of the new Cold War, if I can call it. I try to be a little bit positive in the book, and I do talk about the fact that, in a way, the agency, the economic heft and weight of these emerging and growing markets in terms of population, in terms of resources, in terms of markets, gives them some capacity to say, we will not be dominated by the new Cold War of the Northern Hemisphere, as real as that is and as dominant as that is. Now, if we end up in war, hot war, all bets are off. And then you're forced to choose sides. And
I just want to hear you on the price implication of all of this, the prices implication for UK punters, to use the crude term that Stephanie and I always used to use back when we were both on TV, having to go and do reports on these issues. Yeah. If we have that economic distancing from China, yes, what are the price implications for the voters?
Anything that minimises the capacity for the efficient exchange of goods, finance and technology is going to have a price increasing impact. The question is how much, in what segments, and how important are they for day-to-day living for, let's call it, middle class voters. And the biggest risk is probably in the energy space, because energy is an important component, whether it's through transport or through heating bills and so on, for the average voter. So the interesting question is, can we do an energy transition, which we in Europe desperately need to do, America doesn't, without Chinese inputs? Because the Chinese inputs give us speed and cheap price. So I think we're going to face some real conundrums here. I think you can probably get away in terms of central price impacts with the new Cold War. Life will be a bit more expensive, but not cataclysmically so, except on energy. And energy is the area where I think we could see a divergence as well between America and Europe in how we manage the Chinese relationship.
Robin, what does President Trump II do for all of this?
It does not change the fundamentals of there being a new Cold War. The danger is I think it's unlikely, but it's possible that he could hot it up. But I think the biggest risk of it is what it does to the alliances that the Biden administration has been trying to build to manage this new Cold War. Personally, I think he's got 4 years. 4 years are not going to change the dynamic of America needing allies to compete against China and Russia. And although it might be a bumpy phase for 4 years with Trump, I don't think he's going to destroy the infrastructure of this competition. But I suppose my big risk for Trump, who's in his administration, how does he manage it? If we get very personal here, we go unstructural and we go down to literally personalities. Because we know from the last Trump administration, he wants to do one thing one day, he wants to do something the next. And whoever advises him last has most impact. There are people who served in the Trump administration. There are people on the hard right on the Republican Party who believe we should not be managing this new Cold War. We should be winning it.
It's interesting. You ran Chatham House for all those years, the sort of premier think tank on international affairs that I guess reflects the sort of foreign policy establishment, certainly in Europe, certainly in the UK. So the fact that you're not projecting the end of the world if Donald Trump gets re-elected, I think is interesting and shows the sort of long view that you're taking. But I guess if you were judging President Trump by the results of his leadership as opposed to what he said day to day, he probably did more to increase European defence spending and commitment to NATO, certainly than President Obama had ever done. If you look at President Biden's approach to the Middle East crisis, that has, if anything, diminished the sense of US power and ability to influence very close allies. And when it comes to China, to have an unstable genius, as he did, or what does he say? No, a very stable genius. To have an unstable non-genius who's very unpredictable, contradictory in his statements, never quite clear about whether he's in with the hawks or with the people who would coexist with China. Is that actually, ironically, the kind of leader we might need in this weird period of transition, which would prevent the Chinese from really knowing what they were dealing with?
No. I say no for one reason. No, not because I do not discount the points you make. You could add, obviously we've done two things after Trump. Number one, he asked two things. Spend more on your defense and don't buy your gas from Russia if we're defending you. What the hell are you doing? Of course, we're now doing the other thing he asked, which is buying the bulk of our liquefied natural gas from America rather from Russia. He's definitely got what he wanted. There's one problem, however. I was looking at these figures recently for a little article I wrote for Foreign Policy magazine. The G7 has a larger trade deficit in goods with America today than China has with America.
Except the US.
Exactly.
The UK,
so if you take
rather,
out the US.
But the UK is a
the UK is the one that I think
is
7 billion, exactly. I think we got a 7 billion or so, the last number I saw, exactly, trade deficit with America. So we might be left out of his revenge. But the danger is that he would create instability in the emerging, what I call G7 plus, G9 grouping of countries that are allied to America, that America needs to take on China and Russia, and we need America to take on China and Russia. So the danger is that he could break those alliances by making them much more transactional, imposing tariffs and so on. However, as I said, this is a structural conflict that's going to go on for 20, 30 years. To be honest, I think the G7 will just do like Japan did with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They'll do, you know what, we'll hang together while America's out. We'll wait for America to come back because America is not going to be able to manage this new Cold War without allies.
Robin Niblett, thank you so much.
Okay, two quick things that I found interesting. Firstly, he thinks that defence spending should go to about 3%, but that will be manageable. Obviously, we're at 2.5 now, but it isn't that kind of quantum 0.5% difference will be interesting. And then also he did accept that it will make things more expensive for domestic audiences having this Jake Sullivan high fence, small yard policy around, for instance, China's exporting of EVs.
Which we had heard, we've had that discussion with a few other people, whether that was going to become a bigger thing. I can't help, given that we're recording this on the day of the commemorations of 80 years since the D-Day landings. It is quite striking, and we've written about it today on Bloomberg, that Vladimir Putin's not invited to those commemorations. He has participated in the past. He participated 10 years ago. Soviet Union lost more people than anybody in the fight against Nazi Germany. And arguably, Stalingrad was as significant, Russians would say much more significant, on the Eastern Front in defeating Hitler than D-Day was. And it just sort of goes to some of the points that Robin was making about the challenge that Europe has had in rethinking its approach to security.
I think he tore up his own invitation when he invaded Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
No, I'm not saying, but it shows, we're still hanging on quite rightly to this very important date and what it symbolises, and yet we have this completely new environment, and I think we are just struggling to hold those two things in our minds.
Because we're moving from a post-war world to a pre-war world, or what feels increasingly like a pre-war world, I'm afraid. One of the things that struck me about what Niblett was saying, and what interests me about his book, is that he's focused on China, and that he's unusual for a European to be focused on China. What you get at the moment is Europeans tend to be focused on Russia and the East, and the Americans are absolutely obsessed by China. And I think our debate in this continent is behind the US debate. We're not sufficiently thinking about China. So I think he's absolutely
are we
right
behind,
to anticipate
or are we in
that.
a different economic position, which is we need them more?
I think America also needs them, but I don't think we have recognised the extent to which China is an aggressive military threat.
Right, I think that's it for now from Voternomics. Thanks for listening to this week's Voternomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by Stephanie Flanders, Adrian Wooldridge and myself, Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi with help from Chris Martlew and Julia Manns. Sound design by Moses Andam. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is head of podcasts. And special thanks to Robin Niblett and Swati Gupta. Please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.